A slight limp was all it took to the black belt commanding the room. It looked like the perfect opportunity, a harmless target he could embarrass in front of his students to reinforce his reputation. What he failed to recognize was that the quiet man by the door had already survived battles fought in places where trophies meant nothing, rules didn't exist, and hesitation could cost a life. The Oak Creek Community Center carried the familiar scent of a well-used public building, floor wax mixed with lingering chlorine drifting from the indoor pool, while the unmistakable smell of hard training hung in the warm air. It was Tuesday evening. Fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a dull, uneven glow, throwing sharp shadows across the aging vinyl mats spread across the gym floor. Right in the center stood Derek. At nearly 220 pounds, he filled the space with broad shoulders and an oversized confidence that seemed even larger than his frame. His spotless black gi looked brand new, untouched by years of wear, while the faded black belt around his waist was tied with meticulous precision. As head instructor of the community center's adult self-defense program, Derek carried himself as though the building belonged to him. For him, martial arts had little to do with humility or personal growth. It was theater. Every lesson was another performance staged for the audience sitting along the edge of the mats. Around 15 students watched from folding chairs, hanging on every word as though they were witnessing the wisdom of a master. "You have to own every inch of the room," Derek announced, his booming voice echoing off the concrete block walls. He seized his demonstration partner, a thin accountant named Paul, and yanked him forward with unnecessary force. Paul wore the resigned expression of someone who had already accepted that tonight would be another lesson at his expense. "When people see weakness," Derek continued, "that's exactly what they attack." Without warning, he swept Paul's leg. Paul crashed heavily onto the mat, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. "Sorry, Paul," Derek said with a grin that made it obvious he wasn't sorry at all. He didn't even bother offering a hand. "The street doesn't care about your feelings," he declared to the class. "If you want to survive, you stay solid. You stay unbreakable." Away from the center of attention, near the double entrance doors, another man waited in complete silence. Thomas wasn't watching the demonstration. His attention stayed fixed on the large clock mounted above the bleachers. He was simply counting down the final minutes until the girls' volleyball practice next door ended so he could drive his teenage daughter home. Nothing about him invited attention. He wore faded gray sweatpants, a plain navy t-shirt, and well-worn running shoes. At 42, the thinning hair around his crown and the permanent lines beneath tired eyes hinted at years that had demanded far more than they had given back. Anyone paying close attention would notice the subtle imbalance in the way he stood. Nearly all of his weight rested on his left leg, his right remained unusually straight. Planted with deliberate care, crowded rooms had become difficult long ago. Too much noise, too many unpredictable movements, too many exits to keep track of. Ever since returning from Helmand Province 6 years earlier, his mind refused to switch off. Every unfamiliar room became a mental map. Every stranger's hands were unconsciously monitored. Every doorway, every obstacle, every piece of solid cover was cataloged without effort. It wasn't a skill anymore, it was survival that had never learned how to stop. Most days, Thomas wanted only one thing: to go unnoticed. Unfortunately, Derek had spent years training himself to notice exactly the kind of person Thomas appeared to be. After dismissing the class for a short water break, Derek strolled along the edge of the mats, shoulders loose, confidence overflowing. His eyes drifted across parents waiting for their children, local residents flipping through magazines, and eventually settled on the quiet man leaning against the painted brick wall. To Derek, the posture spoke volumes, the shifted balance, the lowered shoulders, the instinct to stay invisible. In his mind, it all translated into the same thing: easy prey. "Hey," Derek called across the gym, his voice cutting through every conversation. "You by the door." Thomas didn't react. He assumed someone else was being addressed and simply glanced back at the clock. 10 minutes, that was all. "No, you." Derek pointed directly at him, the guy holding up the wall. Thomas slowly turned. His expression remained completely neutral. There was no irritation, no fear, no challenge. Only the exhausted look of someone who had hoped for an uneventful evening. "Can I help you?" "Come here for a minute," Derek said, motioning with 2 fingers. "I need another body. Paul's done for." Thomas gave a small shake of his head. "I'm just waiting for my daughter." A brief pause. "Thanks anyway." It was polite, still the kind of answer most people would immediately respect. But Derek wasn't interested in accepting refusal, especially not in front of an audience. To him, being told no inside his own gym felt less like a response and more like an attack on his authority. He laughed loudly enough to pull every nearby eye toward them. "Come on," he called. "This is a community center. Join in. I'm only demonstrating a wrist escape." "It won't hurt much. I'm good," Thomas replied. This time, his voice carried a quiet finality. The conversation, at least in his mind, was finished. Derek's smile stiffened. Instead of returning to the mat, he stepped onto the hardwood floor and began walking directly toward Thomas. Bare feet slapped softly against the polished surface. The distance disappeared quickly. Around the room, conversations faded. Water bottles stopped halfway to mouths. Students instinctively looked up. The atmosphere shifted as everyone sensed that something uncomfortable was beginning. Derek stopped only a few feet away, folded his thick arms across his chest and looked Thomas up and down. "You know," he said, "I was just teaching everyone about body language." He nodded toward Thomas's stance. "You're practically the perfect example. Leaning against that wall, standing like you can't even support yourself. That's exactly how victims advertise themselves." Thomas met Derek's stare without changing his expression. His eyes briefly settled on the spotless black gi, the polished appearance, and the confidence that filled every inch of the instructor's posture. Then he calmly answered, "I've got a bad leg." Derek gave a dismissive snort. "Everybody's got something. A bad knee, a bad back, a bad shoulder. Life doesn't stop because you're hurting." He gestured broadly toward the class behind him. "The world isn't going to feel sorry for you. If someone wants to make you a target, they won't care what excuse you have." His voice grew louder. "And right now you're telling everyone in this room exactly what you are, an easy victim." Thomas remained perfectly still, no defensive posture, no raised voice, no attempt to argue. He simply looked at the man standing before him with the quiet eyes of someone who had witnessed realities Derek couldn't begin to imagine. "All right," Thomas replied calmly. "Have a good evening." He shifted his body slightly, making it clear the conversation was over, but Derek wasn't willing to let it end. As Thomas turned away, Derek reached out and gripped his right shoulder. The hold wasn't essentially forceful. It didn't need to be. The gesture carried a message all by itself: control, possession, a demand that another man respond on his terms. The instant Derek's fingers tightened against the faded navy fabric, something invisible changed inside the room. Thomas didn't jerk. He didn't gasp. He didn't even appear startled. Instead, there was only the smallest adjustment. His left foot rotated a fraction. His balance settled lower. His right hand lifted barely an inch before years of disciplined control forced it back to his side. For less than a heartbeat, the community center disappeared. The polished gym floor became packed earth. The smell of floor cleaner vanished beneath memories of diesel smoke, dust, and blood. His body remembered long before his mind did. Thomas inhaled slowly, then another breath. He let the memories pass. When he finally looked down at the hand gripping his shoulder, his voice remained almost conversational. "Take your hand off me." There was no anger, no shouting, no threat, only certainty. It sounded less like a warning and more like someone calmly stating an unavoidable fact. Something deep inside Derek reacted before his pride could. A cold ripple of instinct told him to release the shoulder, to laugh, to walk away, to pretend none of this had happened. For one brief second, survival whispered louder than ego. Then he noticed every pair of eyes watching him. 15 students, pock-rents waiting nearby. People who saw him as the strongest man in the room. Backing away now would mean surrendering the image he had spent years building. His pride buried his instincts. "Or what?" Derek sneered. "What are you going to do?" He looked Thomas up and down with exaggerated amusement. "Limp after me? You can barely stand straight. I'm trying to help you stop looking like prey." Before Thomas could answer, another voice echoed from the hallway. "Dad." Both men turned. Sarah stood just outside the gym entrance, still wearing her volleyball knee pads with a gym bag hanging from one shoulder. Her eyes immediately found Derek's hand, then her father's face. Everything clicked. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She knew about the nightmares. She knew about the panic attacks that sometimes stole entire days from him. She knew what Afghanistan had taken. She knew the roadside explosion had cost him more than a leg. Most importantly, she knew the man her father had once been. Thomas's expression softened the instant he saw her. "It's okay, Sarah," he said gently. "Go wait by the car." He reached into his pocket. Take the keys. She didn't move. Instead, she looked directly at Derek. Let go of my dad. A few uneasy laughs drifted through the room. Derek finally removed his hand, raising both palms dramatically. Easy. I'm only trying to help the guy. He glanced toward Sarah before looking back at Thomas. He looks like a strong breeze would knock him over. Then he smiled again. So now you're hiding behind your daughter? A few students shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. This wasn't teaching anymore. It wasn't instruction. It had become something personal, something ugly, yet nobody stepped forward, nobody interrupted. Everyone waited for someone else to act. No one did. Thomas looked at Sarah. The fear on her face bothered him far more than Derek ever could. For 6 long years, he had worked to build an ordinary life. He wanted to be the father who drove to volleyball practice, who burned spaghetti once in a while, who worried about homework instead of survival. He had fought harder for that quiet life than he had for anything else. Now, standing in this gym, he realized something. If he simply walked away, Derek would turn tonight into another story. Tomorrow he'd tell his students how he'd intimidated another weak man. He would convince them that loud voices created strength. That intimidation earned respect. And Sarah, she would remember watching her father accept humiliation from a bully. Thomas slowly placed the car keys into Sarah's hand. Start the car, Dad. Her voice barely escaped above a whisper. Please don't. He's not worth it. Thomas offered the faintest smile. I know, but start the car. I'll be there in 2 minutes. She hesitated. For a moment it looked as though she might argue again. Instead, she nodded once, turned and disappeared through the double doors into the cool evening air. Silence followed. Thomas looked back at Derek. There was no anger on his face. Only the exhausted expression of a man carrying burdens no one else could see. Without saying another word, he removed his jacket. He folded it carefully over the back of a nearby chair. Then he stepped toward the edge of the mat. You wanted a demonstration, he said quietly. Go ahead. Derek's grin widened instantly. The audience was back. You sure about this? I hope you've got good insurance. Thomas answered without emotion. The VA takes good care of me. He limped toward the mat, each uneven step drawing quiet attention from everyone watching. His right leg moved with noticeable stiffness beneath the loose gray sweatpants. At the edge of the training area, he slipped off his running shoes and stepped onto the mat wearing only his socks. Across from him, Derek bounced lightly on the balls of his feet. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, then turned toward the students with absolute confidence. Watch closely. He pointed toward Thomas. This is a real-world example. An uncooperative subject. Notice his stance, narrow, unbalanced, weak. He's practically asking to be taken down. Thomas walked to the center of the mat. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't square his shoulders. His arms rested naturally at his sides. He looked completely ordinary, completely harmless. Whenever you're ready, he said. Derek didn't waste a second. He wanted this finished before anyone had time to doubt who controlled the room. Driving forward with confidence, he closed the distance in a single burst. His right hand shot toward Thomas's chest, aiming to seize his shirt, while his left hand lifted to disguise the strike he intended to throw next. It was the same tactic he'd demonstrated countless times. Grab, disrupt, balance. Finish the exchange. To everyone watching, the outcome already seemed decided. The older man with the limp appeared hopelessly outmatched. Then everything changed. The class clearly saw Derek's hands make contact. What they failed to see was everything Thomas did in the same instant. There was no dramatic wind-up, no flashy movement, no theatrical display. Thomas accepted the incoming force instead of resisting it. His hips rotated just enough to redirect Derek's momentum, allowing the larger man to continue moving forward under his own power. At precisely the same moment, Thomas's left hand rose, not as a fist, as an open palm. The heel of his hand drove sharply into the inside of Derek's elbow. Pop! The joint snapped backward only slightly. Not enough to cause permanent damage, just enough. A surge of searing nerve pain raced through Derek's arm. His fingers instantly released their grip. His balance disappeared. Unable to recover, he stumbled past Thomas with several awkward steps before barely managing to stay upright. Thomas hadn't retreated. He hadn't even advanced. He had simply turned. Nothing more. Derek caught himself, spun around, and stared in disbelief. His face burned red. The smug smile had vanished. What was that? He muttered, flexing his tingling arm. Thomas answered as calmly as if they were discussing the weather. You inhaled before you moved. He paused. Don't advertise your intentions. Silence filled the gym. Paul leaned forward in his chair, eyes wide. Several students exchanged confused looks. Everything they'd been taught suddenly felt uncertain. Derek's embarrassment quickly hardened into anger. His breathing grew heavier. His movements lost discipline. He abandoned technique. Instead, he chose force. With a furious shout, he swung a powerful right hook toward Thomas's jaw. There was nothing controlled about it. The punch carried frustration far more than precision. Thomas watched it develop from the very beginning. He noticed the shoulder dip, the hips opening too early, the tension in Derek's face, the emotion driving every inch of the attack. To Thomas, the punch unfolded almost in slow motion. Instead of stepping backward, he moved forward, straight into the attack. He entered the space where the punch had no room to build power. His left forearm struck Derek's bicep, stopping the swing before it could accelerate. At the exact same instant, Thomas's right hand shot forward. It wasn't a fist. His palm landed squarely against the center of Derek's sternum, a short, controlled driving strike, nothing dramatic, just perfect timing. Combined with Derek's own forward momentum, it produced an explosive result. The air burst from Derek's lungs in one violent gasp. His feet actually lifted from the mat for an instant before he staggered backward, one step, two, three, then he crashed onto the vinyl, landing hard on his backside. The impact echoed across the silent gym for several seconds. Derek could only sit there. His eyes were wide, his mouth hung open. Every attempt to inhale ended in another desperate wheeze. Across from him, Thomas hadn't moved. He stood exactly where the exchange had begun. His breathing remained steady. His expression hadn't changed. He looked less like a victorious fighter than a man patiently waiting for his turn at a grocery checkout. "You're fighting with anger," Thomas said quietly. "It makes you tense, it makes you predictable, and it wastes energy." Derek finally sucked enough air into his lungs to speak. "You." He struggled to his feet. "You son of." The insult died before it was finished. Humiliation had replaced confidence. His students were watching, the parents were watching, everyone had just witnessed the impossible. The quiet man he'd mocked was calmly explaining combat inside Derek's own class. His pride couldn't survive another moment like that. Then his eyes drifted downward, back to Thomas's uneven stance, back to the stiff right leg, back to the weakness he'd spent the last 10 minutes ridiculing. A cruel idea formed instantly. "If that leg's so bad," his voice dripped with bitterness, "let's see how well you stand without it." Without warning, Derek lunged again. This time he lowered his center of gravity and fired a crushing low kick directly toward Thomas's right shin. It was thrown with every ounce of frustration left in his body. Around the room, several students gasped. Even those with little martial arts experience recognized the intent. This wasn't about proving a point anymore, it was about hurting someone. Thomas never tried to evade it. He didn't lift the leg. He didn't check the strike. He simply rooted himself where he stood. The kick landed instead of the dull impact everyone expected. A sharp metallic clang exploded through the gym. The sound rang against the walls like steel striking steel. For one frozen second, nobody understood what they had heard. Then Derek screamed. The cry that escaped him bore no resemblance to the confident instructor from moments earlier. It was raw, high-pitched, filled with genuine pain. He collapsed instantly, clutching his own shin as agony surged through his leg. It felt as though he'd kicked a steel support beam. With everything he had rolling across the mat, Derek groaned helplessly while trying to catch his breath. Thomas simply looked down at him, without triumph, without satisfaction. Only quiet understanding. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached toward the cuff of his right sweatpants. The entire room watched. He lifted the fabric above his ankle higher, past his calf, until the overhead fluorescent lights reflected from brushed titanium and carbon fiber, a prosthetic leg, scarred, worn, built for endurance rather than appearance. Below the knee, flesh had long ago been replaced by engineering. Zavallet's silence settled over the gym, no whispers, no movement. Only Derek's pained breathing broke the stillness. Thomas lowered the pant leg again, then looked across the room. "One thing you said was true." His voice carried effortlessly through the stunned crowd. "The world doesn't care about excuses, it doesn't care about belts, it doesn't care about trophies, and it certainly doesn't care how loud you are." He stepped around Derek without another glance, picked up his shoes, slipped them back on without bothering with the laces, collected his jacket from the chair. Before leaving, He stopped beside the students who had spent months believing strength looked like intimidation. They met his eyes in complete silence. "Real violence isn't a performance," Thomas said. "It's fast, it's ugly. And when it's over, it takes pieces of you that never come back." Without waiting for a response, he turned toward the exit. His uneven footsteps echoed softly across the hardwood floor. "Have a good night." The double doors swung open, then closed behind him. Inside the gym, the self-proclaimed alpha remained on the mat. Outside, Thomas simply walked to his car. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. Amber streetlights spilled across the cracked pavement, giving everything a dull orange glow. Near the curb, an aging sedan idled quietly, warm air pouring from its heater into the chilly autumn night. Thomas opened the driver's door and eased himself into the seat. He didn't slam it, he never did. The door closed with a soft click. Sarah sat beside him, curled into the passenger seat with her knees tucked close, watching him far more closely than the windshield ahead. Thomas shifted the car into drive. Neither of them spoke. 3 full blocks slipped by beneath the tires before the silence finally broke. "You hit him." Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. Thomas kept his attention on the road. "I pushed him," he answered gently. "There's a difference." Sarah looked down at her hands. "He kicked your leg." "Yeah, he kicked it hard." "He did." Thomas released a slow breath through his nose. "He won't make that mistake again." She turned toward him. Streetlights drifted across his face in steady intervals, revealing the permanent fatigue carved into his features. "Are you okay?" The question carried far more weight than the words themselves. She wasn't asking about the confrontation. She wasn't asking whether he had been hurt. She was asking about everything else, the nightmares, the memories, the invisible wounds that never completely healed, the parts of him that Afghanistan had never returned. Thomas reached across the center console and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm all right, kiddo." After a brief pause, he added quietly, "I'm sorry you had to witness that. I really tried to walk away." "I know," Sarah answered without hesitation. He was the one acting like a jerk. Another moment passed before a tiny smile appeared despite herself. "When he kicked your titanium leg," she couldn't quite hide the amusement. "That part was kind of amazing." A dry laugh escaped Thomas. It sounded rusty from lack of use. "It wasn't amazing. It was unnecessary. It was nothing more than pride. He deserved it." Thomas slowly shook his head. "No." His answer came almost as a whisper. "Nobody deserves anything. Life happens. You deal with what's in front of you, but you never go searching for a fight." The rest of the drive unfolded in peaceful silence. Neighborhood streets gradually replaced busy intersections. Older homes lined the road. Large trees stretched over quiet sidewalks. Eventually, Thomas pulled into the narrow concrete driveway beside their modest house. He shut off the engine. For a few seconds, neither moved inside the house. Reality returned all at once. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation finally disappeared. Its absence felt like being struck by a wave. He smiled faintly at Sarah. "Go shower. And don't forget your homework." She nodded before heading upstairs. Thomas remained alone in the kitchen. For several long minutes, he simply stood at the sink, staring through the window into the dark backyard. The refrigerator hummed steadily behind him. No shouting, no explosions, no radios, no helicopters. Only the ordinary sounds of home. He focused on them deliberately, grounding himself, reminding his mind where it really was. Eventually, he limped into the living room and lowered himself onto the worn sofa with a tired sigh. Carefully, he rolled up the right leg of his sweatpants. The titanium pylon itself was undamaged. The kick hadn't harmed the prosthetic. But the violent impact had driven the carbon fiber socket tightly against the sensitive residual limb inside. He reached down and released the locking valve. With practiced movements, he peeled back the silicone liner before lifting the prosthetic free. The artificial leg rested heavily beside the coffee table. His remaining limb was swollen, red tender. A deep ache pulsed beneath the scar tissue where the socket had compressed the flesh. Thomas closed his eyes. Using both thumbs, he gently massaged the sore skin. He concentrated on breathing, slowly in, slowly out. Again and again, there was no triumphant soundtrack, no victorious celebration. This wasn't an action movie. Stopping a bully hadn't erased years of trauma. It hadn't brought back the friends he lost overseas. It hadn't guaranteed a peaceful night's sleep. All it had done was leave him with another bruise and another reminder of everything he'd already sacrificed. Without a word, he reached toward the small bottle of ibuprofen resting on the end's table. 3 tablets landed in his palm. He swallowed them dry. Across town, the atmosphere inside the Oak Creek Community Center couldn't have been more different. Derek was still sitting on the mat. Pain shot through his shin with every movement. The deep bruise continued spreading beneath the skin, forcing him to grit his teeth each time he tried to stand. No one rushed over. No students crowded around him. No applause came. Paul remained seated where he'd watched everything unfold, quietly, thoughtfully. His attention shifted from Derek to the double doors through which Thomas had disappeared. Eventually, Derek forced himself upright. He leaned heavily against the wall, every step exposing another crack in the image he'd spent years creating. His face burned with humiliation. Without looking directly at anyone, he barked. Class dismissed. His voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. We're done. He limped toward the small office at the rear of the gym. The room stayed almost completely silent. Students gathered their gear without conversation. Gym bags zipped. Water bottles disappeared into backpacks. Nobody seemed interested in asking questions. Only a short time earlier, they believed they were learning from someone who understood real strength. Tonight they had watched that illusion collapse. The instructor who preached confidence had singled out a disabled father. The man he'd mocked had shown more restraint and more ability than Derek ever imagined. Paul quietly tied his sneakers. He slung his duffel bag over one shoulder and walked outside into the cool evening air. Under the flickering parking lot lights, something became painfully clear. For months he had accepted being embarrassed, thrown around, talked down to, humiliated. All because he believed Derek possessed some secret formula for becoming strong. He thought toughness meant domination. Volume, aggression making weaker people feel smaller. Then Thomas had walked into the gym. He hadn't demanded attention. He hadn't tried proving anything. He hadn't raised his voice. He simply carried himself like a man who already understood the true cost of violence, someone who knew exactly how dangerous it could be and therefore refused to waste it. Standing alone beneath the streetlights, Paul made a decision. He wasn't coming back. He no longer wanted to learn how to intimidate people. He wanted to learn the quiet confidence he'd witnessed that night. 4 days passed. The weather turned sharply colder. The last dry leaves finally surrendered to the wind, leaving bare oak branches stretching across the suburban skyline. For Thomas, the temperature change brought something familiar: pain. Cold always tightened the scar tissue around his residual limb, making the prosthetic socket feel as though it were squeezing his leg inside a steel vise. He never complained. He simply tightened the straps, swallowed 2 ibuprofen with his morning coffee, and carried on with another ordinary day. Eventually, that ordinary day brought him to the grocery store. 4 days had slipped by. Winter seemed determined to arrive early, and the bitter air stripped the last brown leaves from the oak trees scattered throughout the neighborhood. Every cold front brought the same familiar ache to Thomas's right leg. The scar tissue around his residual limb tightened with the temperature, making the carbon fiber socket grip like a vise. He never complained. He simply adjusted the straps, swallowed 2 ibuprofen, and continued with the ordinary routines that had become his way of surviving. That afternoon, one of those routines brought him to the local grocery store. The produce department glowed beneath bright fluorescent lights that were far cleaner and steadier than the ones inside the community center. Everything felt organized. Rows of fruit stacked neatly, vegetables arranged with mathematical precision, prices clearly marked beneath each display. Thomas appreciated places like this, predictable. Yet no surprises, no chaos. He slipped a plastic produce bag over his left hand and began sorting through a pile of Honeycrisp apples one at a time, weighing each in his palm before deciding whether it belonged in the bag. Nearby, the automatic misting system hissed to life, coating the leafy greens with a fine spray of cold water. He found himself relaxing. Stores like this reminded him how different civilian life really was. Every aisle had a purpose, every shelf had a label, nothing demanded split-second decisions. Just as he reached for another apple, a hesitant voice spoke behind him. "Excuse me?" Thomas didn't visibly react. Years of conditioning reacted for him. His weight shifted instinctively onto his stronger leg. The bag of apples slipped from his hand. Before turning around, his eyes caught the reflection in the polished metal of the refrigerated display. Male average build, tan trench coat, red shopping basket, no obvious weapon, shooter's rounded hands occupied, no immediate threat. Only then did Thomas slowly exhale and turn. The face looked familiar. It took a second. Then recognition arrived: thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a nervous expression. Paul, the accountant Derek had used as his demonstration partner. The same man who had watched everything happen inside the dojo. "Yes?" Thomas asked. His tone remained polite but reserved. Paul shifted awkwardly from one foot to the other. His grip tightened around the plastic basket until his knuckles turned pale. He kept glancing toward Thomas's right leg beneath his jeans before quickly looking away, embarrassed by his own curiosity. "I'm sorry to bother you." He adjusted his glasses nervously. "I recognized you from the community center." Thomas simply waited. He had no interest in revisiting that night. For the past 4 days, he'd hoped the incident would disappear into everyone's memory. Just another unpleasant evening, nothing more. Paul swallowed. "I just wanted to—" He hesitated. "Thank you." Thomas frowned slightly. "For what?" Paul looked down into his basket. Inside sat a frozen pizza, a carton of milk, and little else, the groceries of someone living alone. When he looked back up, his voice had steadied. "For what you showed us." Thomas remained silent. Paul continued. "Derek was a bully. We all knew it. I knew it. But every week I kept paying him $80 a month." He gave an embarrassed laugh. "I convinced myself that humiliation was part of becoming tougher. I thought strength looked like him, loud, confident, the biggest guy in the room. I figured real fighters had to dominate everyone around them." He paused, searching for the right words. The distant beeping of checkout scanners and quiet conversations throughout the store faded into the background. "When you walked into that gym," Paul said softly, "you weren't trying to prove anything. You were just waiting for your daughter. And when he grabbed you, you didn't attack him because you were angry. You stopped him. Nothing more." His voice lowered even further. "You showed everyone there that real strength doesn't need an audience. It doesn't have to shout." Thomas studied the man standing before him. Paul looked ordinary, someone buried beneath spreadsheets, deadlines, bills, and everyday responsibilities, someone who had enrolled in a neighborhood self-defense class, hoping to become more confident, and instead found someone who mistook intimidation for leadership. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something unexpected. Not fear, not guilt, not isolation, something lighter. Violence had always pushed people away from him. His experiences overseas usually made others uncomfortable. People either pitied him or feared him. This was different. His actions had helped someone. Quietly, Thomas asked, "Did you ever go back?" Paul shook his head immediately. "No, I quit." He smiled faintly. "I wasn't the only one. About half the class left after that night. The community center manager got involved. The adult sessions were canceled. As far as I know, Derek's finished there." A tired smile finally appeared on Thomas's face, small, genuine. "I'm glad you left." Paul nodded. "I am too." Thomas rested one hand on the shopping cart. "You don't learn survival by letting arrogant people break you down. You learn by paying attention, listening, staying calm." Paul hesitated again, then asked the question he'd clearly been building toward. "Would you ever teach?" Thomas answered before the sentence was even finished. "No." The single word left no room for negotiation. "I don't teach, I don't compete, I don't fight." A faint smile crossed his face. "I buy groceries, I drive my daughter to volleyball. That's enough for me." Paul accepted the answer immediately. "I understand. I just wanted you to know you earned a lot of respect that night." Thomas nodded once. "Take care of yourself, Paul." The accountant blinked. "You remembered my name." Thomas shrugged slightly. Derek said it often enough. Both men shared the smallest hint of a smile. Paul lifted one hand in an awkward farewell before pushing his cart toward the dairy section. Thomas watched him disappear around the corner. Then he looked down at his own right leg. For 6 long years, he had hidden it, hid the limp, hid the prosthetic, hid himself. Whenever possible, he leaned against walls, stayed in the background, made himself smaller. He believed people would only see weakness. Derek had looked at him and seen prey. Paul had looked at him and seen something entirely different. Thomas bent down, picked up the bag of Honeycrisp apples, placed it carefully into his shopping cart, then headed toward the checkout lanes. This time, he didn't try to disguise his limp. He didn't lean on the cart to make his stride appear even. He simply walked step-click, step-click. The soft, mechanical rhythm of titanium supporting his weight echoed gently across the polished floor. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. For the first time in years, Thomas wasn't trying to disappear anymore. Thomas paid for his groceries without rushing. The cashier smiled, bagged the apples, and wished him a good evening. It was the kind of ordinary exchange most people forgot before they reached the parking lot. For Thomas, ordinary moments had become priceless. He pushed the cart through the automatic doors as a blast of icy wind swept across the lot. Brown paper bags rustled softly while he loaded them into the trunk of his weathered sedan. The engine was already running. Warm air drifted from the vents inside the car. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone with practiced speed, her thumb moving rhythmically across the screen. As soon as Thomas climbed behind the wheel, she looked up. "So," she smiled. "Did you get the good apples?" He fastened his seatbelt. "Honeycrisp." A faint grin crossed his face. "I'm not making rookie mistakes," Sarah laughed. "Good answer." She locked her phone and tucked it into her jacket pocket before looking out through the windshield, where tiny flakes of frost had begun forming around the edges of the glass. After a few quiet seconds, she turned back toward him. "Hey, Dad." Thomas started the car moving. "Yeah?" She studied him for a moment. "I'm proud of you." She didn't explain. She didn't have to. Thomas understood exactly what she meant. She wasn't talking about what had happened at the community center. She wasn't celebrating that Derek had been embarrassed. She was talking about something much bigger. Her father had come home. He was still showing up, still driving her to practice, still buying groceries, still choosing peace whenever he could, despite everything life had taken from him. He was still here. Thomas glanced at her before returning his eyes to the road. For the first time in a long while, the constant weight pressing against his chest felt slightly lighter. The guilt hadn't disappeared, neither had the memories. They probably never would, but somehow they felt easier to carry. He shifted the car into drive. "Let's head home." The old sedan rolled quietly through the familiar neighborhood streets. As houses passed outside the windows, Thomas found himself thinking about something that had never truly occurred to him before. For years he'd believed there were only two versions of himself: the soldier, or the broken veteran, the man who once fought overseas, or the man leaning quietly against a wall, hoping nobody noticed his limp. Maybe neither version was entirely true anymore. Maybe he didn't have to be either one. Maybe it was enough to simply be a father, a survivor, a man who had endured unimaginable hardship and still chose kindness over anger whenever he had the chance. The realization settled over him with unexpected peace. He no longer needed medals. He didn't need approval. He certainly didn't need a black belt to validate who he was. He only needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The confrontation at the community center faded into local conversation almost as quickly as it had begun. People talked. Stories spread. Some details became exaggerated. Others disappeared altogether. But among those who had actually witnessed the event, one lesson remained remarkably consistent. The strongest man in the room hadn't been the loudest. He hadn't been the biggest. And he certainly hadn't been the one demanding everyone's attention. Strength had looked remarkably ordinary. A tired father waiting for his daughter, someone who exhausted every opportunity to avoid conflict before finally defending himself. Meanwhile, Derek found himself confronting a reality he had spent years avoiding. The bruise along his shin healed slowly. His pride healed even slower. Pancrance, who had once praised his classes, quietly stopped enrolling. Former students found other instructors. Some simply quit training altogether. Others searched for schools that emphasized discipline instead of intimidation. The reputation Derek had spent years constructing didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, one uncomfortable conversation at a time, one canceled registration after another, one recommendation that was never made. Authority built on fear rarely survives public humiliation. Thomas never checked to see what happened afterward. He wasn't interested. He didn't browse social media. He didn't ask questions around town. He never tried to learn whether Derek apologized or changed. Those answers belonged to someone else's story. His own story had already returned to where he wanted it most. Home, homework, dinner, volleyball practice, normal life. The kind of routine many people overlook without realizing how extraordinary ordinary life can become after surviving extraordinary circumstances. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen after dinner, Sarah glanced toward her father. "You know." Thomas looked up from rinsing a plate. "What?" "I don't think you realize something." He raised an eyebrow. "What don't I realize?" She smiled. "You've always told me courage isn't about winning." He nodded. I remember. She dried another dish before placing it carefully into the cupboard. But that night, you didn't win because you beat someone. You won because you spent 10 minutes trying not to fight. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at his daughter. Sometimes wisdom arrived from places we least expected. Finally, he smiled. Maybe, Sarah grinned. No, she shook her head. I'm sure. Thomas laughed quietly, a genuine laugh, the kind that had become increasingly rare over the years. For just a moment, the war felt very far away. Winter settled in completely, morning frost-coated rooftops across the neighborhood. Every breath carried a sharp bite that reminded Thomas his body would always remember what it had survived. Cold weather stiffened the scar tissue around his residual limb, and each day began the same way. Tightening the prosthetic, swallowing a couple of ibuprofen, and getting on with life, he never complained. Pain had become another part of the routine. It wasn't something to conquer, it was simply something to manage. Most mornings started before sunrise. Coffee. The local news playing softly in the background, Sarah hurrying through breakfast while searching for homework she insisted she'd packed the night before. Life had settled back into its familiar rhythm. Exactly the way Thomas wanted it. Then, one Saturday afternoon, Sarah looked up from the dining room table where she'd been finishing an assignment. Dad? Thomas glanced over from the kitchen. Yeah, can I ask you something? You just did. She rolled her eyes. You know what I mean. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Go ahead, she hesitated. Back at the gym, when he grabbed you, were you scared? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he poured 2 mugs of coffee, slid one toward the empty chair across from him, and sat down. Sarah joined him. For a long moment he simply looked into the steam rising from his cup. Yes, his answer surprised her. You were? He nodded. I what? She frowned. You didn't look scared. Thomas smiled faintly. Fear doesn't always look the way people think. He folded his hands together. The people who worry me are the ones who claim they never get scared. Sarah listened quietly. When you've seen enough violence, Thomas continued, you stop wanting it. You don't become fearless. You become careful. She rested her elbows on the table. So why did you finally agree to fight him? Thomas looked toward the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the afternoon air. I didn't. Sarah blinked. What do you mean? I never wanted to fight. I wanted him to stop. He let the words settle before continuing. There's a difference. If someone gives you 10 chances to walk away, you take all 10, but if they leave you with only one choice, you make sure that choice ends the situation as quickly as possible. Sarah nodded slowly. I think I understand. I hope you never have to. Silence returned for a while, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Finally, Sarah smiled. You know what? I don't think that black belt understood anything about strength. Thomas chuckled softly. Belts measure training, they don't measure character, she grinned. I'm remembering that. Several weeks later, Paul found himself standing outside another martial arts school. The sign above the entrance was modest, no giant banners, no oversized photographs of champions, no promises about becoming unstoppable. Inside, students bowed before stepping onto the mat. The instructor greeted every newcomer with a handshake instead of a speech. Nobody yelled, nobody showed off. Training partners smiled after practicing techniques together. Mistakes were corrected patiently. Respect filled the room far more than ego ever could. Paul stood quietly near the entrance, watching. One of the assistant instructors approached. First class? Paul nodded. I think so. The instructor smiled warmly. Welcome. There were no sales pitches, no intimidation, no demonstrations designed to embarrass anyone. For the first time since he'd started studying self-defense, Paul felt like he'd walked into a place where strength actually meant protecting people instead of controlling them. As class began, he found himself thinking about Thomas. Not because of the techniques, because of the example. The strongest lesson he'd ever learned hadn't come from a black belt. It had come from a tired father who wanted nothing more than to pick up his daughter and go home. Meanwhile, Thomas never learned any of this. He didn't know Paul had found a better school. He didn't know several former students had quietly followed. He didn't know the story had continued spreading through town. His focus remained exactly where he'd chosen it to be, Sarah's volleyball games. Weekend grocery trips, fixing the loose cabinet door that had been rattling for months, helping with algebra homework, normal things. Important things. One evening, while waiting outside another volleyball practice, Thomas leaned against the familiar brick wall of the community center. Parents chatted nearby. Kids laughed as they hurried through the lobby. Everything felt peaceful. A father standing beside him noticed the slight limp. Old sports injury? Thomas looked down briefly before smiling. No, just part of the journey. The man nodded politely, neither asked another question, neither needed to. Sometimes respect looked like knowing when to leave a story alone. Thomas glanced toward the gym doors. Moments later, they swung open. Sarah emerged carrying her volleyball bag. She spotted him immediately and waved. "There you are. I've been here the whole time," Thomas replied. She laughed. "I know." Together they walked toward the parking lot. Step. Click steep. Click. The familiar rhythm echoed softly across the pavement. This time, Thomas didn't notice anyone watching, and if someone was, he no longer cared. The weeks continued to pass. Life slowly settled into the comfortable rhythm Thomas had spent years trying to build. Every morning began with familiar routines. Every evening ended with the quiet satisfaction that he and Sarah had made it through another ordinary day together. For him, that ordinary life was the greatest victory he could ask for. The memories never disappeared. Certain sounds still made his muscles tense before his thoughts caught up. Crowded places still prompted him to locate exits without realizing he was doing it. Some nights were still interrupted by dreams that pulled him back to another continent, another lifetime. But little by little, those moments stopped defining every hour of every day. Healing hadn't erased the past. It had simply taught him how to live beside it. Sarah noticed the difference long before he did. He smiled more often. He laughed without forcing it. The silence that once filled their car rides no longer felt heavy. Sometimes they drove home singing along to old songs on the radio. Sometimes they argued over where to order dinner. Sometimes they spent the entire drive discussing volleyball, school projects, or whether Honeycrisp apples were really worth paying extra for. Those conversations mattered. They reminded Thomas what peace actually sounded like. One evening, after another volleyball practice, Sarah climbed into the passenger seat carrying her gym bag. As Thomas started the engine, she glanced sideways at him. "You know what Coach said today, what?" She said, "Confidence is quiet." Thomas smiled. "Sounds like a smart coach." Sarah nodded. "I think she's right." She looked out the windshield for a moment before speaking again. "I used to think confidence meant never being afraid." Thomas eased the car out of the parking space. "Most people think that. But now," she turned back toward him, "I think confidence is being afraid and still making the right decision." Thomas looked at her briefly. There wasn't anything to add. She had already understood the lesson better than many adults ever would. "I'm proud of you," he said. Sarah laughed. "You already told me that. I know. I figured it was worth saying again." Across town, the Oak Creek Community Center looked much the same from the outside. Children still played basketball in one gym. Swimmers still hurried toward the pool carrying towels over their shoulders. Families still filled the hallways during the evenings. Only one thing had changed. The adult self-defense class was gone. The empty training room stood as a quiet reminder that respect cannot be demanded forever. Eventually, someone else would use that space. Another instructor would arrive. Another class would begin. But the people who had witnessed that Tuesday night would always remember what happened there. Not because someone won a fight, because someone proved that restraint requires far more strength than intimidation. Paul occasionally thought about reaching out to Thomas again. He never did. Some people leave an impact without expecting thanks. Some lessons are meant to be carried forward rather than repaid. Instead, Paul focused on becoming the kind of person he'd admired that night. Respectful, calm. His new instructor often reminded students that the first responsibility of martial arts was avoiding unnecessary conflict. Every time Paul heard those words, he remembered the quiet veteran standing by the wall, refusing every opportunity to fight until no other choice remained. That memory became more valuable than any technique he learned. One Saturday morning, Thomas and Sarah loaded groceries into the trunk together. Sarah placed the last bag inside and shut the lid. "You know something?" Thomas looked over. "What?" "I don't think your leg is what makes people notice you anymore." He raised an eyebrow. "No?" She smiled. "No, they notice how you treat people." Thomas stood silently for a moment. Then he laughed. "I hope you're right. I am." She slipped into the passenger seat, and besides, she grinned mischievously, "you still picked the best apples." Thomas shook his head with a smile. I knew there was a reason I kept you around, Sarah pretended to gasp. Oh, so that's why? Absolutely. Both of them laughed as he climbed behind the wheel. The sound filled the old sedan warm, comfortable, normal. Exactly the way Thomas wanted life to be. He started the engine, the heater hummed softly against the winter cold outside. As they pulled away from the parking lot, the road ahead stretched quietly beneath the afternoon sky. For the first time in years, Thomas wasn't measuring every passing car. He wasn't studying every stranger. He wasn't replaying old battles in his mind. He was simply driving home with his daughter. Sometimes that was the bravest thing he could do. Time has a quiet way of revealing what really matters. The bruise on Derek's shin eventually faded. The embarrassment that followed him lingered much longer. The story itself gradually disappeared from neighborhood conversations, replaced by newer events and everyday distractions. Like most dramatic moments, it eventually became just another memory. But memories don't always leave empty-handed. Sometimes they leave behind lessons. For Derek's former students, the lesson wasn't about who landed the cleaner technique or who walked away victorious. It was about discovering that confidence built on humiliation eventually collapses under its own weight. For Paul, it became the turning point that changed why he trained in the first place. He no longer wanted to become someone people feared. He wanted to become someone people trusted. And for Thomas, the lesson was quieter still. For years, he'd carried his prosthetic leg like a secret that needed to stay hidden. Every uneven step reminded him of everything war had taken from him. He believed people only saw damage when they looked his way. That Tuesday evening proved something different. Some people would always judge appearances, others would look deeper. What mattered wasn't which group existed. It was choosing not to let either one define him. Life continued exactly as it always does. The seasons changed. Volleyball games came and went. Groceries still needed buying. Bills still arrived. Homework still covered the dining room table. The extraordinary moment that had briefly interrupted Thomas's life quietly gave way to ordinary responsibilities again. And he was grateful for every single one of them. One evening after dinner, Sarah helped clear the table while Thomas rinsed the last few dishes. She looked over with a thoughtful smile. "Dad? Yeah? Do you ever wish none of it had happened?" He knew immediately what she meant. The community center, the confrontation, everything. Thomas turned off the faucet and dried his hands with a kitchen towel before answering. "I wish people didn't choose to bully others." He paused. But once something happens, you don't get to choose whether it happened. You only get to choose what kind of person you'll be afterward. Sarah considered that for a moment. "So, you'd still try to walk away first?" Thomas smiled. "Every time. And if someone wouldn't let you," he met her eyes, "I'd stop the problem, not the person." She nodded slowly. That answer told her everything she needed to know. Later that night, after Sarah had gone upstairs, Thomas stepped onto the back porch. Cold air filled his lungs. The neighborhood was peaceful. A few porch lights glowed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before settling down again. He leaned lightly against the railing and looked up at the stars. For years, he'd believed survival meant pretending nothing hurt, pretending nothing bothered him, pretending he could carry every burden alone. Now he understood something different. Strength wasn't measured by how much pain a person could hide. It was measured by how much kindness they could still offer after enduring that pain. His leg would never be the same, neither would his memories, neither would his life. But none of those things prevented him from being the father Sarah needed. That mattered more than anything else. He smiled to himself, then turned, stepped back inside, locked the door, and switched off the porch light. Tomorrow would bring another ordinary day, another school drop-off, another grocery list, another chance to keep moving forward. And for Thomas, that was enough. One uneven step after another step. Kick, step. Kick, not the sound of weakness. The sound of perseverance, not the rhythm of someone broken, the rhythm of someone who refused to stop, because real strength isn't found in belts, titles, or applause. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't announce itself. It appears in the quiet decisions no one celebrates. The choice to remain patient when anger would be easier. The discipline to walk away when pride demands a fight. And the courage to stand your ground only when there is truly no other option. Thomas never needed to prove he was the strongest man in the room. The strongest person is often the one hoping no fight happens at all. And when peace finally becomes possible again, they choose it every single time.